Welcome everybody to Forza Horizon 4, and today we're taking a look at the 1993 Jaguar XJ220. Now this was produced between 1992 and 1994, with 282 being made. It was actually manufactured by Jaguar Sport, which was a joint venture between Jaguar and a racing team called TWR, as Jaguar themselves were concentrating on their more profitable vehicles like the XJ and the XJS, and yeah. It was originally intended to have a V12 engine and all-wheel drive system that was unveiled in the late 80s as a concept car, but due to engineering requirements both of those elements were scrapped, now having rear-wheel drive and a much smaller engine. And due to these changes and the early 90s recession, it didn't sell anywhere nearly as well as Jaguar had hoped. They did have 1,500 pre-orders with £50,000 deposit each laid out as soon as it was unveiled, but as soon as the changes occurred and the recession came about, yeah, those numbers dropped drastically, because when it was eventually released, it cost £470,000, which is a hell of a lot of money for a supercar even today, never mind back in the early 90s. So yeah, it inevitably didn't sell as well as everyone was hoping it would, and yeah, as a result, this has kind of gone by the wayside in terms of being a classic car, but it still, quite frankly, is, and but another reason for it kind of being, left behind in terms of other classic cars is because obviously the McLaren F1 was released a year later, which completely overshadowed this car as far as mid-engine rear-wheel drive supercars go. Primarily because that car is more powerful, has a higher top speed, and is around 400 pounds lighter. But nonetheless, this is still a cracking car in general. Has a really rather usable interior, leather trimmed, air conditioning, electric windows, electric mirrors, and yeah, really rather good visibility for a supercar, which really wasn't the norm back then. If you look at a Lamborghini Countach, for instance, you couldn't see out the back, you couldn't see where you would around you, and yeah, you certainly weren't comfortable driving it. So yeah, pretty much a friendly supercar in a lot of respects, but underneath it's still got ferocious power for the time, from its now 3.5 litre V6 engine, which had 2 turbochargers, producing 542 horsepower and 473 pounds-feet of torque, which is fairly good, even by today's standards, quite frankly, especially compared to some supercars or even high performance vehicles. And yeah, that was a lot more power than the likes of the Ferrari F40 or the Porsche 959, which this car was originally intended to compete against. But then obviously it came up against the much more technologically advanced McLaren F1, which kind of, like I said, really overshadowed it in terms of its performance and drivability. But considering the inexperience of Jaguar when going into building this kind of thing, because obviously they didn't really have any knowledge in terms of mid-engine supercars, they kind of pulled it off, even if it isn't, the most perfect car you'll ever see. I do like the look of it though, and yeah, I do like the friendly nature that it's gone for, with not much in the way of power, but enough to certainly make it a ferocious car in terms of top speed and acceleration, but also in terms of the interior and the fact that it's even got a boot, which to be honest isn't too much to ask for, quite frankly. But nonetheless, let's get out onto the open road and see what this car can do. So yeah, even though this had an aluminium body and was obviously focused towards being a two-seater supercar, it's still a really rather heavy car at 3,241 pounds, and it's really rather large as well. It's around nearly 30 inches longer than a McLaren F1. Which I already said is about 400 pounds lighter than this, and again has more power from a bigger engine that's also naturally aspirated. But on the whole, this is still a really rather good car. It might have a hint of understeer in terms of handling, which is obviously not the most useful of things to have, but it's better than having uncorrectable oversteer. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's still ferociously fast. Might be slower than the McLaren F1, but considering how much more technologically advanced and lighter and more powerful that car is, there really isn't much in it. 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds, 0 to 100 in 8 seconds, and it going to a top speed of 217 miles an hour. That is still fairly good even by today's standards, especially in terms of top speed. whereas the likes of the Porsche Carrera or McLaren SLR would not be able to match that. Granted, they are obviously slightly newer than this, and emission standards and all that lot might well get in the way of their top speed, but this is still far quicker than them in terms of top speed, and I think pretty much matches them in terms of 0 to 60 time as well. So yeah, despite being far older and far heavier than more modern equivalents, it's still really rather quick even by modern standards. Though again, the McLaren F1 really did beat this resoundingly in pretty much every area. Though I personally prefer this purely because it is a bit more of an easier car to drive, but still really rather quick. I mean, that McLaren F1 might well be quicker than this to 60, but it's only 0.4 of a second in it, which is really not all that bad when you consider how much less horsepower this has. It has slightly less torque, it weighs a lot more, and is obviously a far bigger car. Now, where the McLaren does have this properly lit is in terms of handling, because obviously this is quite a large car, not just in terms of length but also in terms of width, and the additional weight does make it not quite as agile as the McLaren. But that additional weight also does make it a little bit easier to drive because it's not quite so on edge, it's not quite as twitchy, it's a little bit more restrained in terms of oversteer, and yeah, at the end of the day, understeer is a lot more manageable than oversteer, especially when you're dealing with more than 500 horsepower. So yeah, overall I really do like this car. It's easily one of my favourite supercars, especially from the 90s, and especially from before the 2000s, and yeah, quite frankly I don't think it gets enough appreciation anymore. It's kind of reason because of that, obviously because McLaren was far more highly regarded at the time, but this still deserves its recognition and place in history. I mean, for the second time Jaguar had the fastest car in the world at the time. He used to have the fastest car in the world with the XK120 in the 50s, so for the second time in 40 years he had the fastest car in the world, which is a notable thing to have, and yeah, it's still a fun car to drive that really can still shift when it comes to top speed and acceleration. One thing I do really like this car about is that it's got a lovely surge in terms of the power that it's bringing to you. It's not just coming at you in one big lump, it's just a gradual surge, which is also helped by the 5-speed gearbox with really rather tall gears. So yeah, love it really. Yeah, you can even manage to slide it around if you so wish. So yeah, overall a great car. Might have its flaws, which it does, like understeer and a fair bit of weight, and not being quite as good as the McLaren F1, which came out a year after this car started production. But overall, it's still a cracking car in its own right, and yeah, certainly deserves a bit more recognition than it got at the time or even now. Nonetheless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.